excited to be here. So I just started the new job back here in Mines just this last week. So they were bugging me to come give you guys a talk to DREGS, which I was really happy to do, especially because it's live. This is only the sort of second live talk I've been able to give in the last two years and change. So I'm just really excited to be here to a live audience. So like you may have gathered from the introduction, most of this work that I'm going to talk about today is in Canada, and this was done as part of the Metal Earth Research Initiative, which I find that not a ton of people outside of Canada are very familiar with, but basically this Metal Earth project is primarily federally funded. This Canada First Research Excellence Fund put in a big chunk of change. A bunch of the money is housed here at MERC, which is the Mineral Exploration Research Center. It's kind of blocked here. That goes at Laurentian University. And I was super fortunate to be part of this project because basically I was part of a big team of people working on backwards and forwards, working on trying to figure out factors that contribute to variable metal endowment in different parts of the Archean Superior Province. So I'm going to introduce you later in the talk the Wabigoonies, which is a big group of researchers that I was fortunate to work with up there. So of course, just to start, I guess I don't really need to belabor this much to this audience, but why do we care? Of course, mining is a critical component to the Canadian economy. So what I'm showing here is basically on the left is value in mineral production broken up by the different provinces here. And you can see that Ontario and Quebec, which are dominated by the Archean Superior Province, in these 2018-2019 numbers count for about $50 billion in terms of just resources taken out of the ground. So that's roughly 35% of the total production in all of Canada. And then on the right, what I'm showing is also another major component, which of course all of you are very familiar with, is exploration expenditures. So this is broken down by commodity type. You can see that base and precious metals are far and away dominating the amount of money spent in terms of exploration and assessment of mineral resources. And in these 2018 preliminary numbers, basically that's another over $1 billion spent just in exploration expenditures for precious metals like gold. Okay, so when we're talking about these deposits, I just like showing this real quickly. In Canada, and particularly the Superior Province, we're really talking about two major types of deposits. VMS systems, some of which in Canada are quite exceptionally gold rich. These actually formed, of course, at or near the seafloor. Therefore, they tend to be related to when all the volcanic construction was happening in these terrains back in the Archean. And then they get caught up in all this deformation stuff later on and get buggered up. So we need to understand the tectonic system of that. A coincidence with all the tectonic sort of modification is a bunch of localization along big regional fault zones. And this is when we tend to form these orogenic gold style deposits. These are, of course, these big structurally controlled systems where we're getting fluids out of the sort of middle lower crust and channeling up here into these upper crustal fault systems and building these sort of quartz carbonate vein hosted systems that you might be familiar with. So again, I know most of you understand those systems, but I just want to reiterate those are sort of the two primary ones we tend to be looking at in the Superior Province. Okay, so another major driver of this Metal Earth project is, of course, the fact that not every Archean greenstone belt or domain tends to be similarly endowed in gold. So what I'm showing here, this is sort of a grade-tonnage diagram, and what I've compiled up is the world-class Timmins camp. Also from Australia, the Kalgoorlie-Kambalda area of the Western Goldfields, and then the Dryden area of the Southwest Superior Province. And basically what you see is Timmins, these world-class camps, they tend to have some really big, large tonnage, pretty good grade deposits. Whereas in this Dryden area, we really have only some smaller, sort of million-ton guys, a few that kind of kick up towards, a little bit bigger tonnage, but not exceptionally high grade. So a big driver of the research here is basically, why is this? Why do some domains have more gold than others? Is this just a matter of a lack of exploration, fundamental differences in the deformation history, perhaps differences in the architecture and evolution of the belts, or even just the geodynamic setting of them? So we're going to address some of those through this big multidisciplinary project I was a part of at Laurentian Metal Earth. So again, we're really trying to get at the underlying factors that control these variable metal endowment. And the way we decided to do this, they did a bunch of new geophysics, but also lots of boots on the ground mapping, geochronology, geochemistry, to really get at these factors. And we can look at the numbers maybe a different way. I'm going to keep moving this thing around. I'll put it up here. Okay. Basically, the Abitibi subprovince, which is one of the most well-endowed in terms of base and precious metals in the world, Archean greenstone belts, contains many hundreds of millions of ounces of known gold in these orogenic gold deposits, and some of these gold-rich VMS deposits, and hundreds of millions of tons of polymetallic ore in these VMS deposits, where basically the Western Wabigoon only has one world-class deposit, sort of recently opened Winnipeg River mine in the region, and total known deposits actually are an order of magnitude less than the Abitibi, something like less than 15 million ounces that we know of today. Okay, so this is a sort of just a general geologic map of the Southern Superior Province, and so what's showing here are these Wabigoon study areas. So each one of these red lines is what we call a transect. So this is where they ran seismic and magnetic tours and other types of geophysics. So on each one of these red lines, there was a postdoc like me, sort of in charge of a research team with some students and a whole bunch of multidisciplinary research happening. Of course, did my PhD over here in the Abitibi. Mainly for the talk, we're going to focus on this, but I've still been involved in some of these Abitibi studies. So to start off the talk, we're going to zoom into this little box here. I'm going to show you some really cool research that I was involved in from a geophysical perspective, looking at the architecture of the Abitibi using magneto-telluric data sets. So basically, these magneto-telluric models, all the in the white dots are new MT stations that were run as part of Metal Earth, and the blue ones, mostly these are probe MT data. And so basically our student Eric took all these data together and constructed a big 3D inversion model of the magnetotelluric data to look at the resistivity structure in a big three-dimensional volume in the Abitibi. Of course, you can see some of these gold deposits here. These are mostly these orogenic gold deposits, sort of lying along these big major regional fault zones. And you can see some of these really big guys here, like in Mikasa, Larder Lake, here's Rouyn-Noranda, Val-d'Or, and Laurent. And so I just like to show this. This is basically just to show you kind of what's going into his inversion models. Basically, it's a big 3D model. It takes many days on a supercomputer to invert all this data. And basically these MT, it's a passive technique where you leave a sensor out there, you wait for a bunch of lightning strikes and stuff to happen, and then you can measure the resistivity structure pretty deep into the crust and upper band. So this particular model is something like 2.2 million cells, and you can do pretty cool things with these nice hex-MT algorithms, where you can sort of vary the spacing depending on where the data stations are and arrive at a better model. So this is just 3 slices through his giant model that he produced. So this is sort of shallow crustal levels at 11 kilometers, 20 kilometers depth, and then about 40 kilometers depth. And so what we noticed from this model is that there's actually different patterns the deeper we go into the crust in terms of the resistivity structure we see. So the red areas are basically low resistivity, so conductors basically, whereas the blues and the cooler colors, these are more resistant rocks. So we can see in the upper crustal, there's these kind of more narrow pipe-like features and these kind of spotty guys. They sort of broaden out into more patchy mid-crustal conductors. And then they sort of have this sort of wormy pattern much deeper in the crust. And these kind of actually broadly follow sort of the trace of these surface faults. So of course, what's making these resistivity features is Archean crust. So it's, stable Archean lithosphere. Actually, not much has happened to it over the last several billion years. So this is just conductivity values that you might get from different rock types. Of course, granites and basalts. So there's lots of basalts there and the greenstones. Those tend to be these more resistant things. Of course, you can have massive sulfides that are really conductive. Things like brines, pure melts are the most conductive. But we don't really think that they're brines or pure melts because, again, this is stable Archean lithosphere. So all these melts would crystallize. All the brines would sort of back react, especially deeper in the crust. You're not going to have a bunch of free fluids floating around. So we actually think they are as grain boundary films of some conductive material. Could be graphite, more like graphitic schist, or massive sulfides. Well, we think it's these grain boundary films sort of preserved and interconnected at some level deeper in the crust that are forming this. I'm sort of glazing over a whole bunch of details for the purpose of this talk. We actually published early in 2021 a model sort of for interpreting some of this from some of our other geodynamic models. Basically, we think that we have these magmatic and hydrothermal fluids kind of coming up these different fault zones. There's, of course, a protracted history and eventually maybe extensional collapse, sort of helping connect through all these things. This is a shameless plug for that paper. Again, I'm not really giving it justice here, but I just wanted to highlight the publication we put out on UPSL. If you're interested, this is open source. You can just go to my ResearchGate page and get some more details. But also Eric took it a step further, again, with his 3D model and put together this sort of interpretive model of building on what we published last year, basically saying, okay, we have these more narrow pipe-like features where we're sort of localizing these magmatic and metamorphic fluids up these big fault zones and making gold deposits up here, whereas they broaden out into these source regions in the middle lower crust, where we're releasing all these metamorphic fluids and inputting magmatic fluids from the mantle, making much broader sort of conductors here. And then, of course, that might relate to tectonic history, slab breakoff, and sort of enrichment from the mantle. So this also, another shameless plug, just got published. This just came out last week, basically. So again, there's a whole bunch more details, and send me an email. I can send you a copy of this paper. Eric, our PhD student, really carried the bag on this particular study. And it's a really cool feature. It's quite similar to what the Aussies are seeing elsewhere in the world as well. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, we're really going to spend over here where I spend most of my time with Metal Earth in these Wabigoon study areas. So we're going to zoom into there. Before we go into that area, though, I just sort of like showing this next figure here. So in the early aughts, Kirsty Tomlinson did a bunch of work looking into sort of terrain architecture from neodymium isotopes throughout the whole region. Basically, what she was able to find is that in this western Wabigoon region, and this is really how the terrain architecture, as we understand it, sort of came to be, was from this work. Everything looks a little bit more juvenile, so these are much closer, these model ages are much closer to the age of the actual rocks that they're in. Whereas the Winnipeg River terrain here and Marmion terrain, they're sort of loaded with these older signatures, stuff that's up to 3 billion years and even older. So it looks like these terrain, there's a lot more heterogeneity than we see in the Abitibi, which is all basically purely juvenile young crust that was formed in the New York here. So what you can see also is that there's a lot of gaps in the data here. There's not a lot within this particular region. So what I was trying to do was sort of add a little bit better understanding through the Metal Earth work in this particular box. So it's not to say that there's no mineralization in the Western Wabigoon. Again, there's an order of magnitude less known than the Abitibi, but it's not devoid of deposits. So I'd like to show this as well. So these are sort of several major deposits. Of course, there's Sturgeon Lake, which is a good VMS camp that was pretty active in the day. Then there's Hammond Reef. This is a pretty good size, sort of pretty close to 5 million ounce deposit that's marching towards production last I looked. But then most of these on this side within the Western Wabigoon tend to be clustering around about 1 million ounces, or they're poorly delineated. So we have things like this Cameron Lake deposit, Goliath is going towards production, Goldland had a mine in there back that closed back in 90s. And then Kinross and its joint venture was exploring here at Van Horn, and another company here at West was exploring as well. So you can see it's kind of similar to the Abitibi. There are these big regional fault zones and things along which some of these deposits are sort of occurring, but overall much less well understood than the Abitibi. Abitibi's got many hundreds of research papers with theses and 150 years of really, really detailed work, whereas this region just tend to have less focus on it. It is quite similar to the Abitibi in terms of its stratigraphy. So this is just a schematic section to show you that basically we have these older gneissic rocks, a bunch of volcanic rocks, and then unconformities with these sort of synorogenic sediments, just like the Abitibi, these sort of Temiskaming-like successions. We're just going to zoom in there. We're also going to look at this area where I did a bit of work in the Winnipeg River, and then we're going to sort of wrap up the day. I got to click here again on the on this area to the south where we have this sort of Marmion contact. Okay, so again, what I'm going to show you today is a bunch of new structure data, investigations of this broader lithotectonic evolution and architecture, and I'll show you some mapping, petrographic constraints, new laser ablation data, and some of these geophysical surveys integrated in to give us this new perspective. So like I said at the beginning of the talk, I was really lucky because it wasn't just me out there. I had a big team of students I was working with. So me and Stefan Perudi sort of advised or co-advised all these guys. So there's me, Becky's a PhD student. I'm going to show you a bit of her work next. We had a good set of master students, David, Amo, and Kendra. We were working on various aspects of the intrusive history. She was working on AMS study where they're looking at putting in a nuclear waste repository in the region. And Kendra, I'll show you some of her stuff, trying to date some of the timing of gold mineralization in the region. And then a whole set of field assistants and undergraduates that did a bunch of great research for us in terms of undergraduate theses. So to start, this is Becky's research. Basically, she did a great job of compiling up a bunch of geology, integrating a bunch of legacy observations from the surveys, mag data, a bunch of our new observations, and we put together this new sort of 1 to 50,000 scale map for the region. She then used this in part as input for some prospectivity analysis, and then compared a similar this data set to the well-studied Timmins camp in the Abitibi. And so the map itself, this talk is loaded with shameless plugs. So go check this out. This map was published, released with another publication where she did the prospectivity analysis. And basically what she was trying to do with this prospectivity analysis was look at bedding variance and dispersion and Linnaean variance based on the map geology as well as the mag maps. Basically, you can think of these bedding variance maps, things where there's like folds and stuff, you're going to have a lot of variance, whereas things like shear zones are going to tend to have low variance because everything's going to be pretty well aligned. So she did the same thing for Timmins as she did for the Dryden area, and she clipped out the sort of big intrusive complexes here. And again, you can see these hot zones are where there's high variance, these cold zones are where there's lower variance, so actually shear zones. And again, we can kind of think of these as relating to both structural traps and pathways for potentially mineralizing fluids. And the same thing here in Timmins. You can see a lot more sort of good correlation with the deposits because there's a bunch more in Timmins. And basically, she was able to outline, produce this figure, which basically she's showing a distance between high variance anomalies and low variance anomalies. So again, like fold culminations and shear zones or faults. And what she found was that there was two completely separate trends for the Timmins and the Dryden area. So what's, I want to go forward. So basically in the Dryden area, which is this sort of light gray trend here, everything clusters either really close to the low variance anomaly or the high variance anomalies. Basically, all the occurrences tend to be clustered only near where we have those features. Whereas in Timmins, there's basically a continuous thing, and grade actually increases towards where we have these low variance anomalies, these big structural controls. So for whatever reason, there's this more or less sort of continuous trend here, whereas in the Dryden area, it's sort of a bimodal distribution in terms of relationship of occurrences, gold occurrences to these higher low variance anomalies. Again, I realize I'm covering all this rather quick, and you should go check out the paper. This is also open source, was published last year with Tectonic Physics. Really, the paper is about trying to apply new principles, different types of principles to prospectivity analysis. And these two case studies that we used were in the Timmins and Dryden area are sort of highlighted in this paper. Okay, so next I'm going to show you a bit of my work. See, I'm doing on time. Okay. Next, I'm going to show you a bit of my work. So this next bit is going to be focused on stuff that's from the Winnipeg River up here in this study area. And basically, we've known for quite a long time, this is basically epsilon hafnium versus uranium lead age diagram. So we can look at things like sources from mantle or crustal contamination. And if you look along these lines here, basically, these are going to be sort of if we extract something from the depleted mantle at 3300 MA, it would just evolve along this line. And so when we have a bunch of data plotted way down here, that suggests that we actually have really old rock stuff that's 3500 MA or older, but we've never seen any rocks of that age in the Winnipeg River. It's sort of just this whispers of these isotopic inheritance within this Winnipeg River data. So we decided to kick around up here a bit and see if we can figure out what was going on. Yep, this is just, we're going to zoom in on this area. So this is the Cedar Lake Gneiss area. So this is the road to Red Lake. It's really easy to get to. There's all these beautiful lakes you can kick around on. You can see some of those older samples, stuff that's about 3200 in age, that had some of that isotopic inheritance came from here. And it's a pretty complex area in terms of these gneiss domes and things. But I'm just going to only really focus on this singular sample from right there for this data. And basically it's zircon from this ortho-gneiss, banded ortho-gneiss sample. And when we got the data back, we were pretty surprised because it was pretty spectacular in terms of its age. So these are what the zircon grains look like. They have pretty complex patterns in them. They tend to have these cores and overgrowths and things. But if you look at the ages, that's what's really crazy. 35 MA for the core of that, 34.75 for the outer rim. So basically these are the oldest known zircon grains in the entire southern Superior Province of Canada. And it looks like they're enclaves of these really old crusts floating around in these gneissic domains of the Winnipeg River subprovince. So here's the Concordia diagram of it. So it's showing a big bullseye here at 3550 MA. So we think the protolith is this really old 3550 age. There's a scattering towards sort of younger ages. These are sort of just a breakdown of those oldest age populations sitting in there. So we, you know, depending on how you want to break up the data, might be between 3530 and 3550 MA. Either way, it's really old zircon and some of the oldest rocks that we know in the southern Superior Province. They also have these fantastic trace element signatures. So basically you can see in the oldest rocks a really nice primary magmatic signature, whereas in these younger ages, zircon domains, they pull off up here to higher uranium-cerium ratios. Basically, these are sort of metamorphic, sort of anatectic zircon. These also plot, the oldest ones plot really close to this mantle array, sort of suggesting that they were sort of derived from a pretty primitive mantle, so melting of a really primitive basalt to form this granitic protolith. And they have fantastic lutetium hafnium sort of data to them too. Basically, this is that epsilon hafnium again. And even though the rock is this old, we can start to think, well, actually it probably had some inheritance that's all the way into this 3600 range. Just want to show this just to show that it's not purely a lead loss story. It's definitely old rocks. And yeah, so then I decided, well, hey, like, you know, what do these relate? Is it be similar to what we see globally? So basically I compiled up, and these are data density plots for a whole stack of data from a global compilation that I put together. So blue is the Minnesota River Valley, stuff from South Africa, the Catfall craton. The purple here is Pilbara. The yellows, parts of the Indian cratons. And basically, what I'm arguing with this data set here is that actually this part of the Winnipeg River looks quite similar to these other cratons, like Catfall and Pilbara in particular. So it seems like they're actually relating to a really old crustal growth event and may have been global in scale. So what may that have looked like? You know, we don't really know if there was subduction at the time, but I like this particular model from our former colleague here, Richard Palin. Basically, it's probably these old arc-like things. We start forming these granites and smashing together, and you have sort of the progressive zircon ages that I saw in my data set. Basically, these are probably recording the onset of plate tectonics, or at the very least, a big early crustal growth event, which was wholly undescribed from the Southern Superior Province prior to this study. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the Neo-Archean history a bit more detail. Basically, in the Neo-Archean, the Winnipeg River was sort of thrust over the western Wabigoon, sort of north over south. But then we had a lot of localization along these big fault zones, these sort of big structures here, where we actually started forming some of these gold-bearing structures. So our master student Kendra focused on this for her thesis work. So this is a map she put together. So you can really see these this north over south sort of kinematics. And then we had a bunch of localization along these big major regional structures. So there's sort of three big guys. There's the Wabigoon deformation zone, this Manitou to Norwich deformation zone, and Mosher Bay Washapegama deformation zone. Basically, they're accommodating sort of different sinistral or dextral shear as everything's sort of localizing and crunching together. So she focused on some stuff along the Manitou to Norwich, but we also had some master students. There's Kinross was in a joint venture, so they had these beautiful exposures here at this Van Horn, where there's these nice orogenic gold occurrences, where we had a couple of our bachelor students do a bunch of great mapping. So I'm going to show you some data from there first, and then I'm going to show you some data from these orogenic gold occurrences here up in Goldland and in Ken West. Okay, so this is about a 10-meter scale here. So this is a big, beautiful stripping. And basically, Lauren, we had two students who did sort of a paired bachelor's thesis. Lauren basically looked at the structure and vein history. And then Jordan, I'll show you in a second, was more focused in on the alteration. So Lauren's thesis, she was able to outline all these gold-bearing veins and shear through here. And basically, the gold-bearing veins appear to be associated with sort of V2 vein set, these sort of oblique set that based on the orientation and the relative cross-cutting relationships were in place during dextral shear along this Wabigoon deformation zone. Whereas Jordan was really more focused on alteration. So this is where the intensity of alteration is mapped out. And he took a bunch of samples through here and some other outcrops to look at most and least altered rocks within this particular system to outline the geochemical signature of the mineralizing sort of event. So what you can see from this data here is that there's pretty good enrichments in gold, silver, tellurium, sulfur, carbon, lead, tungsten moly. So this is a pretty classic signature, of course, of orogenic gold deposits, but it's a really nice sort of complementary work that laid out the mineralization here. So what's really interesting about these rocks also, so this is actually some native gold sitting here in this little buggered up pyrite. It's sitting in direct contact with a hydrothermal mineral xenotime. So this gave us the idea, hey, if we can actually date xenotime like this, we might be able to directly date the timing of the fluid flux events associated with the golden placement along these particular structures. So Kendra basically went here at Ken West and at Goldland and found a bunch of samples. So here's actually some monazite in this case with some electrum. There's xenotime sitting in there with the alteration assemblage. There's xenotime here in the matrix. The relationships were a little less clear here at Ken West, but there's still native gold and xenotime and sort of textural association. So we lasered a whole bunch of xenotime and monazite, and basically we're able to outline some distinct age populations observed in these grains. She compiled up a bunch of data from the Abitibi subprovince so we could compare across the Southern Superior to see if the major timing of hydrothermal events were different in the Wabigoon versus the Abitibi. And basically it's sort of east to west on this diagram. So in the Abitibi, there's titanite and moly ages here on this orogenic gold fluid flux event at about 2660, which makes sense with this sort of structural relationships. Also, a bunch of ages cluster up here at about 2580, and this is sort of a late sort of fluid remobilization event. So we think we have a very similar timing of events in the xenotime. We see about this 2660, 2640, and these sort of 2590 ages. So what we're arguing here is that actually all across the Southern Superior Province at sort of the same time is when we're releasing fluids from the mid-lower crust and sort of making these orogenic gold deposits. So even though the Wabigoon tends to have much less gold, still seeing gold fluid flux events at the same time as the Abitibi, which is quite interesting. So this is accepted, it's in press. It should come out in Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences here as soon as they send us the proofs, hopefully next month. Oh yeah, and we're hoping to date at Van Horn and Goliath. Actually, our lab guy is looking at the Van Horn samples right now to add to this data set so we can have a bit better of a regional perspective. Okay, so just to summarize the undergraduate student work, basically in Kendra's work, we do have orogenic gold mineralization. It's not wildly dissimilar to what you see in the Abitibi. There's these beautiful brittle ductile deformation zones along which a bunch of this mineralization is occurring. Looks like it's happening at a similar time. And our prospective zones, particularly along that Manitoulin-Genomic and Wabigoon deformation zone, but that south central part of the study region butting up against the Marmion subprovince was much less understood. So is that relating to some broader architectural control? Well, who knows? So I basically went down there, did a lot of focus work in this particular part of the region, because there is another one of these big, beautiful fault zones here, and right along it, this is all Temiskaming-like sedimentary successions. So all the classic indicators of what you might think of a good place to have orogenic gold deposits, but there's basically nothing down here. And this is just a sampling of data, of zircon data from some of the intrusive and nice and plutonic rocks for the region. And basically, the top figure is a whole bunch of ages from a Neo-Archean guy that was definitely in place at the same time as this Temiskaming Basin more or less was forming, right here at about 2700 MA. You see it has all these really old ages in it. So there's a whole bunch of inheritance recorded in this particular felsic intrusive rock that's sitting right down here. That, hey, what do you know, when I look at the data from all this Marmion subprovince, which has this really long and multiple pulses of crustal growth in this Marmion terrain, going back not only at 2700, but 2850 and all the way back to 3GA. So the same sort of fingerprints of ages that I see in the Wabigoon subprovince we see in this Marmion terrain. So it's basically telling us that at least this portion of the Western Wabigoon appears to be built right on top of some of this old Marmion crust that's had this multiply reworked history. We do have a little bit of this is a focus seismic section here, sort of right across that fault zone. Basically, I'm just showing this because that Temiskaming-like basin is really a shallow guy. That Mosher Bay, Washibegama, we can't really track too deep. But what we see is all these really flat line reflectors and all this stuff that I'm interpreting as this underlying Marmion crust sitting right below that part of the Western Wabigoon. So what does that mean for the broader architecture? Well, I also have some other regional samples. So this is in the green data here. This is the Teakwood-Lawrence batholith. So this is 2730. It's sort of a little bit older than this Temiskaming succession, but still sort of synvolcanic with the whole Western Wabigoon is forming. And those tend to cluster on these trace element diagrams close to something that looks more like a depleted mantle or a mid-ocean ridge basalt. But if we hop over the Manitou-Norwich deformation zone into this Ravel batholith, which is basically the same age, we see this really evolved crustal signature. We can even look at something that's a similar in age to this stormy basin stuff in this islet stock that's sitting right here on the margin of the Marmion subprovince. And basically it also has that really evolved crustal signature. So what I'm interpreting these data to mean is that basically it's giving us insight into where we have more juvenile crust and where we have multiply reworked, more evolved crust on which our greenstones are being built. This is having a massive effect on the distribution of ore deposits in the region. So if we take a step back, basically what we're arguing with this data is that there was probably pretty limited gold availability in the upper crust here. So there's not a really good connection between a nice enriched mantle and the crust, because we have all this over-thickened Meso-Archean and older crust. It's been reworked multiple times, sort of tried, the sponge has been dried out a few times. We don't have a lot of good connection between adding gold from the mantle, because it's sort of getting caught up and not getting into the sponge. Whereas on the other side of this particular structure, things look like much more juvenile, and we tend to have much more better gold availability, or have much better connection. Perhaps these structures are sort of long-lived, sort of, earlier rift structures that provide good translithopheric structure and communication between the mantle and upper crust, and help us build some decent sized deposits and sort of the upper crustal block to this big structure here. Okay, so I know that was a whole mess of data for you guys. And again, I sort of glazed over a lot of details on some of the publications and stuff. One of the fun things of Metal Earth is that there's all these students. It's not just researchers like me, but there's a whole bunch of good student work that's been coming out and will keep coming out over the last couple of years. But just to reiterate, basically the Southern Superior Province parts of it, we're talking about 1 billion years of Earth's history, all the way from the origins, when we sort of had these original crustal nuclei like the Winnipeg River subprovince. But then we have younger stuff like the Marmion, progressively built through the Meso-Archean, then these big, beautiful juvenile domains like the Abitibi subprovince, where the Neo-Archean, where we start making deposits. But what's important is that it's really important to understand that geologic history and terrain architecture with respect to the distribution of your deposits. So you're probably not going to find a good orogenic gold deposit in the Wabigoon subprovince. Maybe if you're exploring for pegmatites and stuff, that might be a good place to go. But for things like these orogenic gold deposits, it really seems to be limited big parts of the western Wabigoon, because it was in this pericontinental setting. We're building a greenstone belt right on top of and next to multiply reworked and sort of dried out crust in terms of its gold content. Whereas other parts of it, hello Siri. Whereas other parts of it are much more juvenile and seem to have better communication between the mantle and allowed us to have deposits forming. So really doing this sort of like background work to figure out exactly where your most prospective parts of your terrain are. So taking that broader, like get off your property and look at the big picture in terms of your terrain architecture will really help you identify where more prospective domains occur in a particular region. So thank you.